Spyro the Dragon was released for the PlayStation in 1998. It was the second title developed by Insomniac Games, following the well-received but commercially unsuccessful Disruptor. As a response to the lack of impressive sales figures, their then distributor Universal Interactive convinced the upstart developers to try for something with more of an all-ages, mass-market appeal. Sony's PlayStation was, at the time, severely lagging behind the Nintendo 64 in that department, and they wished to expand the demographics that they could appeal to, rather than be content with marketing their console exclusively to older gamers and to the hardcore crowd, especially after Naughty Dog's success with Crash Bandicoot. But enough with the history lesson, let's get into the game. It begins with a poorly written and poorly voice-acted cutscene that initially stars a dragon who we can only assume had recently escaped the local old age home. He's quickly pushed aside by a tough guy dragon who promptly begins hurling childish insults at the game's antagonist, Gnasty Gnorc. Gnasty Gnorc has apparently bugged the area with cameras because upon hearing this dragon call him simple and ugly from his lair, he doesn't take kindly to it and cases all of the dragons in crystal with the exception of a young one called Spyro. It's never explained why Spyro was skipped over, but now, obviously, it's up to him to save the day. Following a truly bad opening cutscene, which is thankfully and mercifully brief, we're allowed to begin playing the game, and its simplistic genius is very easy to feel right from the get-go. Insomniac CEO Ted Price, when reflecting on the development process, recalled that he and others on Spyro's relatively small team had a Nintendo 64 in their workspace and would frequently play Super Mario 64 for inspiration. He noted that they spent a lot of time in the first area of the game, just exploring, jumping, and running Mario around in circles. The phrase used by the team to describe Mario's controls was toy factor, meaning that they still found the game fun to mess about with even when they weren't actively engaging in the game's primary goal of collecting stars and progressing through the castle. With that in mind, Insomniac's developers set out to fine-tune Spyro's controls to a degree that simply running Spyro around the environment would still be fun even before they added in enemies to fight and goals for the player to achieve. And the controls for Spyro are very smooth. Smooth enough that you never even think about them while playing. It becomes second nature rather quickly. The only thing that may throw modern players for a loop is the way the camera is controlled. Since the original PlayStation controller did not have joysticks, and not everyone who owned a PlayStation owned the DualShock controller that came out the year prior, the camera is controlled with the L2 and R2 shoulder buttons. If you think that is antiquated, you're completely right, but it is really easy to get used to, and it works fine. The only clumsy thing is that the other set of shoulder buttons are used to make Spyro perform a roll maneuver to dodge attacks in either direction, and accidentally hitting the wrong buttons can lead to moments like this. This roll maneuver could probably be useful in many parts of the game, particularly on some of the bosses, but I usually forget that it's even there. Thankfully, there's an option in the menu to set the camera to active mode, which causes the camera to follow Spyro more actively and makes the need to use the dated shoulder button control scheme much less frequent. This can lead to the occasional wonky camera movement, but it's very, very rare, and far better than the average 3D game from this era. Still, it would have been nice if the game had been programmed for dual analog to give an additional option for players who did own the DualShock. It's a strange omission given that the game does support usage of the left stick to move Spyro as an alternative to the directional pad, and it utilizes that sweet, sweet rumble feature every time you free a dragon. The core gameplay of Spyro the Dragon involves navigating Spyro through 3D environments while freeing the dragon's Gnasty Gnorc imprisoned and collecting treasure scattered through the levels. Each time you free a dragon, it triggers a brief cutscene where they sometimes offer gameplay tips, but usually just spout useless nonsense like,
Thank you for listening to me.
Or,
that you, Spyro? Are you the young dragon I've been hearing so much about? Ever since you're a wee puff of smoke, we've known,
You've known?
I forget.
Spyro also often has some cocky, smart-ass phrase to spit out, which gets old pretty quickly.
Where's Nasty Nork? I'll torch him.
I guess the logic behind this characterization was to make Spyro relatable to whatever snot-nosed brat they imagine to be playing the game, but I find him off-putting.
Bring him on. I think I smell a barbecue.
His voice is particularly grating. Fortunately, these cutscenes are brief, but I'd still prefer a protagonist in this type of game to be more easy to like. Following the cutscenes, a platform is revealed where the dragon used to be that enables the player to easily save their progress. While out searching the land for dragons and treasure, various enemies will of course be standing in your way, and you're armed with both a charge and flame attack to deal with them. Large enemies can only be attacked with the flame, while armored and shielded ones are only vulnerable to the charge attack. Occasionally, you'll run into other enemies that require a more creative strategy to deal with, like Norks that are both large and armored, and later in the game you'll meet enemies that can even manipulate environments as a method of attack, instead of just simple melee and projectiles. The enemies are primarily green Norks, with different theming depending on the level, with some other things thrown in for the sake of variety, like shepherds and rams, witches and warlocks, killer trees, attack frogs,
Attack? Frogs?
and these things. But the enemies don't excel because of their designs. They excel because they're programmed to actually interact with Spyro and react to what he does, including these guys who taunt you by showing you their asses. Some younger gamers may find this hard to believe, but having enemies that did more than just pace a predetermined path was a fairly new thing back in '98. The big mechanic that separates it from most 3D platformers is Spyro's ability to glide through the sky. This is the primary tool for exploration, and where some light puzzle elements come into play. Many areas can't be accessed without beginning your glide at the very top of a jump, since you're always traveling on a downward trajectory, and many areas can only be accessed by gliding from very specific spots. It's also often necessary to hit the triangle button to drop from your glide, or to draw backward on the D-pad or analog stick to make Spyro slow his roll to land on the smaller platforms. There are some other gameplay elements along the way to add depth to the experience, such as needing to locate keys to unlock chests full of gems or even to progress further in levels, chasing down thieves to reclaim dragon eggs, and supercharge power-ups which allow you to supercharge. You also get a dragonfly buddy called Sparks who accompanies you, picks up nearby gems for you, and acts as your life bar. He changes color each time you take a hit and disappears after taking 3, which not only results in a death after one more hit, but also forces you to pick up gems all by yourself, which is more cumbersome than it looks. The game is organized into several hub areas known as homeworlds, all with differing themes. The attention to detail that went into making each one stand out is truly top-notch, from the environments, enemy types, color palettes, right down to the character designs and personalities of the dragons themselves. The homeworlds each contain several portals that lead Spyro to the main levels, much like the magical paintings in Super Mario 64. One of the many small pleasures this game has to offer are the visuals you see and the sound effects you hear when going through the portals, as the treasure you pillaged from the previous level is added to your total and Spyro makes his way to a strange new land. It's a brilliant way to take what is obviously a loading screen and disguise it as something much more exciting. In these levels, collecting an adequate amount of the previously mentioned dragons, gems, and eggs is crucial to being able to progress to the following homeworld, as each one contains a balloonist who requires you to have X amount of one of these things before he will take you onward, until you eventually reach Nasty's world. In addition to the main levels, each homeworld also contains a portal to a shorter level that features a boss, and all but the final also contain a flight level as well, renamed to Speedways in the sequels. In the flight levels, Spyro can actually fly as opposed to just glide, and the object is to flame a certain amount of items or enemies, and fly through a certain amount of rings or arches before the timer runs out. Each time you check one of these off your to-do list, a few precious seconds will be added to the timer, and you can only get every gem the level has to offer by knocking them all out in one go. These are great fun, and do quite a lot to provide much needed gameplay variety. The level of difficulty in Spyro the Dragon achieves the unlikely by being an appropriate level for a wide range of players. It's an extraordinarily simple and easy game to pick up and play regardless of experience, and it's very easy to progress to the final fight with Gnasty, even for the young player. You're given time to learn the controls and adjust to them in the first homeworld, since enemies will run from you and cower in fear there, and health power-ups are doled out pretty generously throughout the game in the form of fodder, which are small, level-specific creatures found roaming about that, upon being attacked, will release a butterfly for Sparks to eat to regain a hit point, or to bring him back after he's been wiped out. However, completing the game 100% by freeing every dragon, collecting every piece of treasure, and reclaiming every egg does pose a moderate degree of challenge. Gems are often tucked away in areas that aren't easy to reach without extensive exploration, and can sometimes only be reached by going to a high place at or near the end of a level, and backtracking to it, or, in this case, before the starting point, from the new heights you've reached at the end. It took me ages to find a certain hidden area in the Stone Hill level as a kid, and I think veteran players will know exactly which part I'm referring to. There are also a couple of levels which feature puzzles that must be solved by jumping from supercharge ramp to supercharge ramp, or by utilizing the supercharge ramps to take unorthodox paths to find the last of the gems and dragons. I think the game could have benefited from a little bit more of this in particular. The negative aspect of all of this is, of course, the frustration that comes along with having to backtrack an entire level, meticulously searching for the one or two easy gems that you happen to overlook. I've played through this game dozens of times, and while it really doesn't happen often, it does happen at least once or twice every time I give it a go. Once you do fully complete the game by finding all the stuff, you're rewarded with an additional level where you get to raid Gnasty Gnorc's treasure stash with a flight power-up. While it's not particularly deep or challenging, it is so much fun to grab all of that treasure in one place after spending the whole game building up what you have little by little. This is a beautiful looking game, thanks in no small part to the brand new engine Insomniac was able to experiment with, which allowed for panoramic views. This engine's capabilities, along with the expansive backgrounds and expressionistic skyboxes, give the illusion that these levels were far more vast than they actually were. The PlayStation's limited RAM capabilities forced many games on the console to use a fogging effect in areas not in the player's vicinity, so the game wouldn't crash trying to load everything all at once. And in even worse cases, some games would make elements of levels completely invisible until the player came closer to them. There was nothing more frustrating in this era than a turn appearing in front of you in a racing game with no time to react. Insomniac avoided these flaws entirely by using a level of detail system that renders faraway parts of levels as lower resolution versions of what they actually are. This innovation allowed for smooth gameplay free of crashes and preserved the open world feel this game was clearly striving for. All that combined with the previously mentioned portal animations, balloon travel, and level variety, along with little details like interactive and destructible environments, really give off the feeling that this game is taking you on a huge adventure. I remember as a kid seeing these peaks off in the distance and thinking it must be where Gnasty Gnorc was. But no, not quite. That was just a portal for the first boss on the other side of the map of that particular homeworld. But that's the sense of wonder this game instilled in me as a kid. Even little things like the sound effects, down to Spyro's idle animations, are very memorable. The only thing that does detract somewhat from the open world feel are the force field barriers placed in some levels to wall them in. That being said, there's really nothing else they could have done, and they're extremely rare anyway. It's funny to me though, because as a kid I didn't understand that the purpose of these things was to put a cap on the level. I assumed you could travel beyond them, and I spent an embarrassingly long time trying to figure out how. Another thing that still stumps me to this day is this little aisle, way off the beaten path in Misty Bog. It is possible to reach it, I've done it before, but I was unable to on this playthrough. There's no treasure or anything on it, but it's so perplexing because it's probably the only piece of scenery in this game that's far away from the main level and serves seemingly no purpose aside from aesthetics. It reminds me of the truck in the first generation Pokemon games. Underneath my rambling, you may have noticed the game's soundtrack playing, and if you have, you've probably thought to yourself, wow, this music is amazing. That's because it is. These masterpieces were composed by none other than Stewart Copeland, best known as the drummer and co-founder of the British rock band The Police. Copeland was given early versions of each of the game's levels to play through to get inspiration for what each level's music should sound like, and his work is especially impressive when you're aware of the time crunch he was placed under, which required him to crank out pieces for around 3 levels per day. It may sound like, aside from some minor nitpicks, I'm heaping praise all over this game. But that's only because we haven't gone in depth yet on the bosses. They are, beyond all doubt, some of the worst in all of history. If that sounds like hyperbole, well, it isn't. The 4th boss, Metalhead, is actually pretty fun. Not challenging really, definitely not original, but fun. You don't attack him directly, but rather have to take out his power sources when their force fields shift around in order to shut him off. And if you can't figure that out for yourself, there's a dragon directly outside his hideout who flat out explains it. But why am I talking about the 4th boss first? Because the other 5 bosses are identical. Yes, identical. They run, you chase them, you dodge their attack if they even bother to attack you, you flame them, rinse, repeat, they die. No challenge, no creativity, no fun. Remember my earlier point about how cool it is to have enemies that react to your every move? That doesn't apply to the bosses, really. They mostly all follow the same preset, boring paths, and ironically, the very first boss stage is the most difficult of the bunch. Not because of the boss itself, who is just as pathetic as the rest, but rather because of these annoying dogs. But regardless, they're still all the same, and it's especially unforgivable that the final boss receives this same copy-paste treatment. It's a huge disappointment after such a good job was done making the journey to get to him seem so epic, with the dragons you rescue hyping him up as a big challenge, the levels in his homeworld being so different in tone with munitions factories, grenades, and machine guns to act as symbols that something big and bad is coming. Then he just goes down like a normal enemy. To top it all off, none of these bosses even speak at any point in the game, aside from Nasty in the opening cutscene where he utters a grand total of 7 words. It's a real shame that their unique and cool character designs had to go to waste, because they're given no development, no backstory, no personality, and no attention of any kind. The only non-boss level I really don't like is Misty Bog. Just look at this disgusting mess. The level is absolutely massive and not very well designed, so it ends up being tedious to get through. Most of it is completely flat aside from some fun platforming near the end, but it also has a dead-end path with some of the most unfair enemy placement I've ever seen. I swear it's impossible to get through this room without taking a hit or two. But for the most part, the levels feature consistently good design throughout. Despite their open-ended and explorative nature, most of the larger ones, aside from Misty Bog, feature an easy way to get back to the beginning once you reach the end, even if they're not entirely circular. That way if you get lost, it's easy to get back on the right track. Some of my favorites are Dark Hollow, Ice Cavern, and Lofty Castle for the amazing atmospheres they create, Cliff Town and Dark Passage for the big glides they offer, Treetops for its supercharged puzzles, Metalhead for having the game's only acceptable boss fight and for its secret areas, and North Cove and Twilight Harbor for the darker theming and for having the most challenging enemies. Despite abysmal bosses, which are unfortunately a major black eye on an otherwise excellent game, and the other flaws I've nitpicked along the way. None of these things prevent Spyro the Dragon from being an incredibly fun experience, an outstanding technical achievement, and a bona fide PS1 classic. This game earns high marks almost all across the board for outstanding gameplay, music, graphics, level design, art direction, and innovation in performance. Spyro would go on to become one of the PlayStation's unofficial mascot characters, and this little game made by a small, inexperienced development team would spawn a franchise that we will definitely be looking further into here on Leaky Faucet Productions. If you enjoyed this video, please consider subscribing, liking, sharing, and ringing the bell so you don't miss any future videos. This has been a Leaky Faucet review. Thanks for watching, and I will see you next time.
Spyro, it's great to see you, but I've got to go.